Well, howdy, folks. Welcome back to history class. Today we're going to turn our attention to the Middle East for a few days, and we're actually going to start by kind of walking through the history of Israel as it became a modern nation in 1948 and in the decades that followed. So, if you remember, as we've kind of talked through the year, the Jewish people kind of had a difficult stretch ever since the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire in 70 A.D. Then kind of the last Jewish rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, is put down in the mid 130s AD, and then from there, the Jewish people really spread across the world in what they called the diaspora. Some of them settling in North Africa, some in Southwest Asia, some into Europe. And then, as we saw, as particularly suffered tremendous persecution in both the Middle Eastern lands that they settled among the Arabs once the Islamic religion took over the Arab world, and then also a lot of persecution in Christian Europe as well throughout the Middle Ages, and even continuing into the modern ages. And so we looked at some of the modern persecutions of the Jews in the pogroms in Russia, the Dreyfus Affair in France. And then, of course, the most significant modern persecution of the Jews that ever was the Holocaust, which we looked at in some detail. Well, you come to the end of 1945, and don't forget that in the midst of the late 1800s, you had Theodor Herzl had become the father of the concept of Zionism, which is the idea that because this whole living as a minority group among many different nations was not necessarily working out for the best interest of the Jewish people, that there ought to be a Jewish state, that there ought to be a Jewish nation. And Herzl was a little bit agnostic as to whether that needed to mean a return to the Holy Land or not. There were some Zionists who considered trying to buy tracts of land in South America and some different other places. But ultimately, most people that adopt this Zionist viewpoint want to return to the ancestral homelands of the Jewish people in what had been the biblical Promised Land. And so the opportunity to make this happen kind of gets started in the early 20th century. You see a handful of Jews begin filtering into what was then known as Palestine, and the word Palestine actually derives its name from the ancient Philistines who once lived there. And the realm that at the beginning of the 20th century was being called Palestine had kind of belonged to the wider Ottoman Empire that controlled most of the Middle East. But at the end of World War I, that gets liberated from Ottoman control and is placed in the hands of the British. Most of the Ottoman lands in the Middle East, the League of Nations divided them between Britain and France and gave them as what they called mandates, which the idea behind a mandate is it was kind of a semi-colonization where they had them for a period of time, although the goal was supposedly to be working them toward independence. Well, Britain kind of starts talking out of both sides of its mouth as it relates to what it's going to do with the land, because during World War I, one of the most memorable aspects of the World War I had been the guerrilla war waged by the Arabs with the help of the British General T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, who became the subject of one of the first really great films, although I haven't seen it, but that's the reputation it has. Supposedly it's really great. I need to see it. It's one of those bucket list things. I didn't see Casablanca until 2 years ago, but it actually was as good as everyone said it was. So I was impressed that it was able to live up to the hype. But anyway, so Lawrence of Arabia, basically had promised the Arabs that if they helped with the guerrilla war against the Turks, that they would be able to get independence from Britain. Meanwhile, a British diplomat by the name of Arthur Balfour, who worked in the British Diplomatic Corps had issued something called the Balfour Declaration, which is an official policy position of the government of Great Britain, saying that the Holy Land should be, that the Jews should be given a homeland in the Holy Land. So Britain has basically promised both the Jews and the Arabs the same land, which is not a good recipe. Because the Jews and the Arabs have typically not always gotten along very well, and that has gotten worse in the last 100 years. So, the majority population of the land was Arab, but you start to have more and more Jewish settlers, and a lot of them start kind of streaming to Israel, what's now Israel, before World War II. But then World War II happens. And more specifically than World War II, now the Holocaust happens. And certainly, it's the most violent expression that anti-Semitism had in European history, at least in recent centuries. And so there's, as a result, a lot of Jews move out of the Holocaust and say, yeah, we need our own land. This whole, living at the mercy of Europeans is not working out well for us. And so there begins to be an increasing move back to the Holy Land. Now more Jews now live in the United States than anywhere by number. Israel has by far the highest percentage that's Jewish, obviously, but people from across Europe begin to move from there to Israel after World War II, and also some Americans even come. Some American Jews even come. So what they begin to do is there begins to be fights between Arabs who want to keep the Jews out because they've got a long history of anti-Semitism as well, and then some of the Jews that were coming in kind of wanted the Arabs to go for the same kind of old rivalries or the sense that maybe they felt like they were entitled to the land and then obviously there were some people that wouldn't have minded some cooperation, but there was violence all the way back into the 1940s as soon as this whole thing gets started. But at the end of the Holocaust, the public opinion of the world moves to such sympathy with the Jews that now there's more support for creating a Jewish nation. And in 1947, the UN proposes, there's a plan that's proposed in the United Nations that would divide the British Mandate of Palestine into two independent nations, a Palestine ruled by the Arabs and an Israel ruled by the Jews. Well, the Arabs did not like the plan. For one, now the one little grievance that they could have at the beginning that's legitimate was the fact that the Jews made up about a third of the population of Palestine by the time, and we're going to get about 55% of the land. So they would be saying there's more of us here. Why did we get the smaller portion? And that's a legitimate question. What's the problem though is that a lot of the Arab public opinion was not saying we should get a larger chunk. It should be saying there should be no Israel at all. We don't want the Jews here. There was this kind of violent anti-Semitism around it, and so a lot of Jews did not want Israel to exist at all. Did not believe it should exist because of the hatred of that they had for the Jewish people. So you've got. You've got a handful. Some of the Arabs want more of the land. Many of the Arabs want the Jews to have none of the land. And then obviously the same thing is playing out on the Jewish side. Ultimately, what winds up happening is because of the way the Arabs respond, they refuse to sign in on the partition plan, and it winds up with a situation where Israel claims, functionally the whole thing. So. 1948, Israel declares its independence, declares itself to be an independent nation, and the state of Israel is recognized on day one by the Americans under President Harry Truman and some other important powers. However, the Arab world revolts, and not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but 6 Arab countries declare war on Israel the first day. The day that they announce that they are declaring themselves an independent state. 6 nations declare war on them. Welcome to the world, Israel. So before we go into how the war goes, let me jet aside off to the Arab world and say kind of what's going on there. So you don't need to know every single ruler of all of these countries, but several of the 6 Arab countries, which were Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and what's the other one I'm forgetting? Looking at your book here, just try to see. Lebanon, that's the other one. Most of those countries were monarchies that had been that were established at the end of World War One. The House of Saud controlled, the traditional homelands of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula, and they took the name of Saudi Arabia, which is the only country in the world that actually has a family name in the name of the country. Iraq at that time was a monarchy under a king named Farouk. The most important, and in Jordan, you should know, because Jordan is a country that neighbors Israel. The king of Jordan was a fellow by the name of King Hussein, who actually has a little bit after the initial war. So, because Israel and the Arab world are going to fight 4 significant wars between 1948 and 1975, and after a little while, Jordan's going to have a little bit more conciliatory position towards Israel than some of the other places will. But the leader of this whole group was actually not a traditional monarch, but a modern authoritarian dictator of a modern socialist bent by the name of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And Nasser is probably one of the most important figures in Middle Eastern history in the last 100 years. Nasser I believe he had been an Egyptian military officer, if my memory serves, but he wound up seizing control of Egypt, and he was a supporter of what he called Pan-Arabism. We mentioned in the previous video the idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea of calling for African unity. Pan-Arabism was a similar thing in the Islamic world. So Pan-Arabism said all the Arab countries ultimately should unite over time. And this actually culminates. Egypt and Syria actually united to form one nation called the United Arab Republic for like a couple years, and then they decided it wasn't working and split again. But Nasser, one thing to say, Nasser was a Muslim, but he was not an Islamist. So the difference between a Muslim is someone who follows Islam. An Islamist is someone who believes that an Islamic government, which is what like Osama bin Laden was fighting to have, where the rules of the world are controlled by the Islamic Sharia law. He was a little bit more of a secularist in terms of government. He was more attracted to socialism. He was in the Cold War stuff. Egypt becomes an ally of the Soviet Union. And he wanted a certain level of modernization for the Arab world, although he wasn't very successful at achieving it. One of the reasons Nasser is really important to understand is that a lot of the success of the Islamists, like Sharia radicals, like Ayatollah Khomeini, who takes over Iran in '79, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and guys like bin Laden and guys like that. Part of their appeal was the sense that the secular Arab socialist pan-Arab nationalist project of Nasser had failed. So a number of people in the Arab world are kind of willing to give Nasser's view of things a try, and the fact that Nasser is unable to succeed at certain aims they'd set, including most notably the destruction of Israel, is what leads people to say, well, this is because we've abandoned the reality of how we're supposed to be, letting Allah rule the world, and we need to go back to Islamic theocracy like in the days of the Caliphate. So that's kind of how the kind of Islamic radical movement gets started, is largely rejection of Nasserism, although in the little intervening period where both of those movements are going on simultaneously, Nasser would often side with some of those guys in certain ways, especially as it relates to common enemies like the Israelis and so on. So Nasser is, when part of the reason for this coalition coming together is this is kind of Nasser kind of making his play for leadership of the whole Arab world, but all the traditional monarchies go along with him. So 6 Arab countries declare war on Israel on day 1 in 1948. And astonishingly, the young Israelis win the war. Ultimately, one thing that happens is that over the course of the war, Israel doesn't just claim the land that had been set aside in the UN partition, but they also go on and claim a lot of the land that the UN had planned to give to the Arabs. And in the process of that, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, that is, he was basically the senior Islamic religious leader in the city of Jerusalem, called for an evacuation, and it appears that a lot of this was done for political, and at least this is the Israeli side of the story. There's some Arabs who tell you different. It's kind of a hotly debated topic, it seems most likely to me that this was true, that the Grand Mufti actually called for a level of evacuation of Jerusalem in an attempt to create a refugee crisis that would create political favoritism toward the Palestinians, and that gambit kind of succeeded at one level but failed in practicality because it didn't actually solve the problem. So what happens is a number of Palestinians get displaced from their homes and have to set up shop in UN-run refugee camps along the border of countries like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. Jordan probably has more of them than anyone else. This winds up causing some domestic troubles in some of those Arab countries as they have such huge refugee crises. It becomes a PR nightmare for the Israelis because they kind of get blamed for this refugee crisis, whether it's entirely fair or not. And the UN, I think, has condemned Israel more than they've condemned all other nations combined, which is not a good sign for the UN because Israel is not perfect in all of its actions, but I can promise you they are not the worst human rights abusers in the world. I can promise you that. There's still a function. They're the only, until the U.S. invasion of Iraq, they were the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. For all that people accuse them of being an apartheid state and so on, the reality is there actually are Arabs serving in the Israeli Knesset, which is their equivalent of the parliament. I think it's the left-wing critics of Israel, I think, give it a very bad rap in a lot of ways. Which is not to say that they've never done anything wrong, because there have been moments. But, so 1948, Israel seizes some of this land. The idea of the whole two-state plan of the UN goes out the window, largely because the Arabs didn't accept it. And then, once they didn't accept it, Israel said, for the sake of our security, let's take some more of this land to give us more of a buffer zone. Because the thing about Israel, you got to understand the geography of it. I wish I was in the classroom and I could point you on the map and show you stuff. Maybe look at the map on page 1018 in your textbook. You'll see it a little bit better. But Israel is literally surrounded by hostile powers on all sides. They border basically all of these countries, and all of these countries want them gone. So Israel has a border with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, with Syria, with Lebanon. So that's, of the 6 countries they went to war with, they bordered with 5 of them. The only exception was Iraq. They've got 5 countries that all wanted them dead on any side of them. And so Israel has to, from the beginning, take a kind of they've had to develop some kind of unusual ways of doing things. One thing is that in Israel, literally every single adult is required to be a member of the military, male or female. Every single Israeli citizen goes through a time of service in the Israeli armed forces. And doesn't mean you have to make a career out of it, but you have to go through the training because the idea is we never know when we're going to be, majorly invaded and need to rely on every single Israeli knowing how to use the guns and, all this kind of stuff. Israel does set up a democratic form of government. Early Israel did lean a little bit towards socialist economics. The first president was a fellow by the name of David Ben-Gurion. Some of that socialist economics came from the fact that some of the first Israeli settlements were known as kibbutzes, and they were these kind of communal farms. However, Israel starts to, bring in more free market reforms as time goes on. And the Israeli people, though small, there's a couple major cultural things that they accomplished. One, they revived the speaking of Hebrew, which had basically fallen largely out of circulation. They actually make it the official language of Israel. It's not to say that no one was speaking it, but it was not a majority spoken language anywhere in the world, and even a lot of the the Jews and the diaspora wouldn't have necessarily been able to speak fluent Hebrew. Israel revives the Hebrew language, which is really impressive, really an astonishing feat. And then another thing is just in general, Israeli people are at the top of so many different fields. They're an unbelievably high accomplishing nation in terms of sciences, in terms of arts. I mean, you look at any classical orchestra. I mean, the Israelis are some of the best on every instrument. Some of this breakthrough in military science, some of the breakthrough in health and stuff. I mean, they've been doing great work on some of this viral stuff right now. Just over and over again, they're the best at a lot of things. So. So nonetheless, Israel has about 5 years of not a major war, but there's still some security threats to them. In particular, Syrians like to launch rockets into Israel from a range of hills known as the Golan Heights. One thing I should say, too, is that Jerusalem, on the UN partition plan, one thing that's unique about Jerusalem is that Jerusalem is considered the holiest city by all three major monotheistic religions in the world, right? Because obviously it is the holy place in Judaism. You come into Christianity and there's a little bit of a sense of God's made the whole world the dwelling place of God, now in Christ or whatever, but there's still a certain special mystique that attaches to Jerusalem in Christianity, and even, the idea of a new Jerusalem is connected with the concept of heaven and the new creation and the new heavens and the new earth. So, I mean, Jerusalem's still kind of special in a certain way in Christianity. And then in Islam, the Muslims believe that Muhammad was taken up by Allah without dying a natural death, and that he was taken up from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, also known as the Dome of the Rock. Now, the problem is the Al-Aqsa Mosque is built on the land of the old Hebrew temple, which, the so-called Wailing Wall is the last standing piece of the old temple, and daily, Jewish people go out there with the yarmulkes and the whole deal, and they rock and pray for the coming of the Messiah at the Wailing Wall. And so with all of that, Jerusalem is a pretty important city to a lot of people. And so Jerusalem was actually going to be made an international city under the UN plan that ultimately was rejected. The way the 48 War shook out, Israel got part of Jerusalem, but part of Jerusalem was still controlled by Arabs. Well, the next, there were skirmishes here and there always, but the next major war happens in 1956, about 8 years later, the Suez War. And in this case, so the Suez Canal, I think we mentioned this earlier in the year, the Suez Canal was built by Egypt during the time where, it was during a period of time where Britain had kind of semi-colonized Egypt, and the canal was built and basically controlled by Britain after it was built. So it was the Suez Canal is vital to the world economy. A lot of the world's oil moves connected to it, and it kind of opens up trade to the Mediterranean for that part of the world in a greater way. The British had controlled it, but it was within Egyptian territory. Well, Nasser, again trying to assert his Arab nationalism against an England that had become a symbol of European imperialism, decides to seize the Suez Canal and run it as as a fully Egyptian project. Well, the British and French declare war on Egypt over this because they both had strategic interest in the region that they didn't want Nasser to be able to interfere with. The Israelis also declare war along with them because, and I'm not even sure, they may have been the first to make the declaration of war. I can't remember, because the problem for the Israelis was they were afraid that the Egyptians, because the Egyptians hated Israel so much. I mean, remember, they literally don't believe Israel has the right to exist. They refer to the day that Israel declares independence in the Arab world as Al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe. So they had a very reasonable fear that the Egyptians would prevent the Israelis from using the Suez Canal for shipping, and that would be a major hurt to the Israeli economy. So they joined the war as well, and they asked for the United States to help. But President Eisenhower makes what I think is actually kind of a surprising foreign policy decision and actually sides with the Egyptians in the Suez situation. The Soviet Union was allied with Nasser and did the same thing as well. Now, it's not often that the U.S. and the USSR agreed on anything during that time period, but when they did agree on something, that's normally how it went down. So the Suez War winds up being an Arab victory as Israel, Britain, and France are not able to get the support of either the Americans and they got the active opposition of the Soviets. That kind of swings that in favor of Nasser. Well, fast forward, that was 56. Fast forward 11 more years, and for the third decade in a row, we're going to have a major Arab-Israeli war. And this one is going to be the Six-Day War of 1967. And this is one that changes everything. So the reason they call it the Six-Day War is because Israel wins this daggone thing in a week, which is impressive. Because they're fighting not just one country, but again, like the first time, they're fighting 4 or 5 countries and beat them all in 6 days. Israel saw that the Egyptians had amassed a large army in the Sinai Peninsula, which is the part of Egypt that borders Israel, which is actually kind of where the whole Exodus Red Sea thing went down, was kind of connected to that stretch of land. And, pardon. So, they see the Egyptian troops amassing in the Sinai, and they realize that war is probably going to happen. So they determined that if war is going down, then perhaps we should strike the first blow. And I believe, I'm trying to remember who the Egyptian leader was. I think it might have been Omer, but I'm not positive. But anyway, they make the decision. They make the decision to launch the 6-Day War. They make the decision to make the first strike rather than let the Egyptians have a chance of attacking first. And they send in the Israeli Air Force, goes in like flying really low, dangerously low, so that they could avoid Egyptian radar. And they launch these surprise attacks and like decimate the Egyptian army like before the fighting gets going. Like they take out the entire Egyptian Air Force basically, ensuring that the Israelis have significant air supremacy. And in the process, they're also dropping bombs on their tanks and all this stuff. So, I mean, before the war is on, the Egyptian and Syrian forces have taken huge losses right away. In the midst of the 6-Day War, Israel makes a decision that has become controversial in world politics, but I'm completely on board with what they did here. They make the decision that, because Israel, as of 1966, was a very small country, about this. I mean, it's not very large now. It's about the size of the state of New Jersey or something. But they were a much smaller nation then, and there was several specific areas: the west bank of the Jordan River, which was a part of, I believe, it was a part of the country of Jordan. You had the Golan Heights in the north that were connected to Syria. You had the Sinai Peninsula that was connected to Egypt, and all of those regions were threats to Israel, and like they were getting rocket strikes from the Golan Heights all the time. Uh, and So what they decide to do is, let's just conquer these areas on our border and gain control of them so that they won't be used as weapons against us. And so they go in and start seizing land. And so they seize land from Israel, from not from Israel, from Jordan, from Syria, and from Egypt. But the most significant is that is an Israeli army under the leader of Israel's army during the 6 Day War was a colorful fellow by the name of Moshe Dayan, who had a big old eye patch like Nick Fury or something, where he'd lost an eye in a previous military engagement. So he's got this big old eye patch. And Moshe was, so his name is Moses, if translated into English. So Moshe Dayan is the leader of the Israeli forces, and Dayan's forces wind up actually gaining Israel complete control over the city of Jerusalem. Particularly, they took the region that is known as the Old City, which is where the center of action was back in the glory days of David and Solomon, and where the old temple was, where the Temple Mount was, where the priest once made sacrifices to God and everything, and where currently stood, signaling future controversy, and what was currently the site of both the Wailing Wall, but also the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the 6 Day War, Israel wins this sweeping war, really kind of humiliated the Arab world and took a lot of this land back. It would not be another decade, though, until there was another war, because from some 67 on, the Arab world was gunning for revenge. One thing in particular that was an important step along this way is in 1964, just a few years before the 6 Day War, there was an organization established among the Palestinian refugees known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And when it was originally started, there were some militant, militia groups in the midst of it. There were also some kind of civilian branches as well. But the militia groups really took control of it, and it became fundamentally a terrorist organization. And the leader of the PLO was a man by the name of Yasser Arafat. And so Arafat kind of emerges as the leader of the Palestinian faction. And so in the midst of all this, you've got the PLO and the continuing refugee crisis, and then you've got the 6 Day War and all these countries losing ground, which means that there's going to be yet another major war breakout between Israel and Egypt. By now, Nasser has died and has been replaced by a general who becomes the second Egyptian president by the name of Anwar al-Sadat. And so I'm trying to see. Yeah, so it was a joint Arab attack. Egypt, once again, in the leadership. Egypt was the main driver of a lot of this stuff, even though the other countries were joining in too. So once again, there's a combined Arab alliance attacks Israel in 1973, and this war is known as the Yom Kippur War because Sadat launched the initial strike on the Jewish high holy day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is the holiest day in Judaism, and was the holiest day in the Old Testament. It was the day that, in the Old Testament where the lambs were slaughtered and the sins were atoned for the year, for the nation. And so, Israel is kind of on a holiday footing, and the Egyptians and the other Arabs launch a surprise attack. This war goes better for the Arabs and worse for the Israelis. Ultimately, by the end of the war, Israel agrees to a treaty where they surrender the Sinai Peninsula land that they seized from Egypt back to Egypt, but they continue to hold on to the other conquest of 1967. And so that's going to be the last major unit war that they fight against a unified Arab force, because there's going to be some steps towards peace there in the near future. 1977, Anwar Sadat has decided that this whole vendetta against Israel is becoming counterproductive, that Egyptian lives are being wasted, that there's really no continuing reason to oppose Israel's existence, and decides to start trying to make peace. This literally cost him his life, because after he makes peace with Israel, a Muslim extremist is actually going to assassinate him in retaliation for doing this. But Sadat meets with the Israeli prime minister, who by then was a man by the name of Menachem Begin. I'm begging for Begin strips. Remember those commercials? Okay, so anyway, so Sadat and Menachem Begin actually meet in the United States at Camp David, which is a presidential retreat center in Maryland. And Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States at that time. And this is probably Carter's greatest accomplishment as president, actually. And Carter serves as the middleman and the negotiator between Israel and Egypt. And they actually wind up working out a peace deal that brings peace to the Israeli-Egyptian border. Now, Israel still has some issues on some of their other borders, like with Syria and Lebanon, because by then Syria has come under the control of a tyrant by the name of Hafez Assad. Perhaps you've heard about his son Assad being in the news in recent years. If you've followed the Syrian civil war at all, his son is still in power. And there's still, and Lebanon winds up being a little bit of a basket case as well. We'll look at that in maybe tomorrow's video if we have time. But Lebanon winds up, they were at once the most prosperous country in the Middle East, even had a little bit of democracy. Beirut, the capital city, was the financial center of that part of the world. It was one of the most prosperous cities. Actually, people were fairly well off. And then this extraordinarily complicated civil war breaks out in the late 70s, early 80s that involved not one, not two, not three, but 4 factions fighting for control. It turned into a mess. The U.S. sent peacekeeping troops over there at one point that wound up when Reagan was president. This wound up being a bad deal because like a Lebanese radical actually wound up driving a truck bomb into the U.S. Marine barracks. The Israelis took a part in that war as well. You don't need to know all the details of it, but just to know that's kind of going on. But Israel now has, peace on the Egyptian border, and that has held since the late 1970s. And in fact, one of the strange things of the last couple years has been the fact that a lot of the Arab countries have kind of, while continuing to use anti-Israel propaganda in public to appease their people, have actually kind of quietly allied themselves with the Israeli government against the Iranian one. And we'll look at the emergence of Islamist Iran tomorrow. So just a couple more footnotes on kind of how the story goes in Israeli history. There was a major, in the 1980s, Israel still has some conflict. Like I said, they got involved in the Lebanese civil war and some other things, some terrorist attacks. But in 1987, there was a widespread uprising that was known as the Intifada, which is an Arabic word for uprising. The Intifada was basically rioting the streets that turned into a functionally civil war. It started with demonstrations, then turns into attacks on soldiers. And the Intifada really continues until the 1990s. And then they wound up signing a peace treaty called the Oslo Peace Accords in like 92 or 93 that was going to wind up, the idea behind it was to start working toward, a two-state solution, to working towards the idea of partitioning Israel again as they had been the plan in 48. But so far that has seemed like a distant hope, because every time there's a real prospect for peace. Somebody throws a rock at some soldiers, and then things go bad again. And so Israel has justifiably not really felt that there's been enough of a condition of peace there to justify really handing power over to the Palestinians over part of the country, especially since the Palestinian Authority, which is the kind of quasi-governmental power there in the Arab part of the country. The first time that they get the chance to vote concerning some things, they actually empower Hezbollah, which was not Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the Shiite Iranian. They actually empower Hamas and actually start electing Hamas officials, which Hamas is one of the most notorious of the Arab terror organizations. So, so far, Israel has not had a moment where they have really thought it was appropriate to go forward with this. Two Israeli leaders that you probably want to know from recent years. One is a fellow by the name of Yitzhak Rabin, that's the Hebrew word for Isaac. So Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister who negotiated the Oslo Accords with Arafat, and he is assassinated by an Israeli extremist who didn't want peace with the Arabs. So on the Arab side of the world, Sadat signs a peace treaty and gets killed by his own people, and then on the Jewish side, Rabin signs a peace treaty and gets killed by his own people. So that's kind of been some of the danger of trying to be a peacemaker in the Middle East, is that some of those who have tried to do it, it hasn't ended well for them personally. And then in addition to that, the other leader you want to know is a fellow by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the president of Israel for something like 20 of the last 35 years. I don't know the exact numbers, but he was president in the 90s and a stretch of the early 2000s. Then he went away for a while. He made a comeback in the late 2000s and basically ruled Israel throughout the 2010s and still rules today, although he's faced with some scandals and some stuff today that he's starting to become a controversial figure again. Netanyahu was a little bit more of a hardliner than was someone like Rabin. He's kind of tended to be a little bit more hawkish at times. So the Intifada happens in the early 90s, and then there is a second Intifada somewhere around the year 2000, where there's yet another outbreak of violence in Israel. I think this was connected to an Israeli presidential candidate visiting the Dome of the Rock, and they were offended that a Jew would dare touch and disgrace the mosque or whatever. I don't even think he walked in the mosque. I think he just visited the grounds, and they got so offended over it. And a lot of this outrage was kind of manufactured by Arafat and the PLO. But the second Intifada, a similar thing, turns into a lot of terrorist attacks. Israel had to deal with a lot of like suicide bombers, where some of the Muslim extremists would go put on strap up with dynamite and charge themselves into restaurants, or just different things like that. So it's been a turbulent history for Israel, but they somehow have actually built a very thriving and successful society in the midst of a very, very turbulent world, and in the midst of almost constant warfare and insecurity. Israel's actually had some relative peace for the last few years. It hasn't been as bad as usual, because a lot of the Arab countries have kind of taken their sides against the Iranians. Of course, they're also staring at a potential Iranian nuclear threat as well. One thing I should say about how all this went down is that Israel, in addition to having one of the strongest armies in the world, and we believe being a nuclear power, they've never officially said that they do, but everyone believes that they have nuclear weapons. But in addition to all that, Israel also has probably the best intelligence apparatus in the world, known as the Mossad, that have been able to do some very impressive things for the sake of keeping Israeli security. You might have seen a Steven Spielberg movie called Munich. That was about in 1972, I believe, at the Olympics. Some PLO terrorists killed several members of the Israeli wrestling team at the Olympics in Munich, Germany. And the Israeli Mossad responded by like hunting down every one of them and assassinating all of them. They made a movie out of it. It was pretty cool. There was when Iran was getting close with their nuclear program a few years ago, there was this mysterious stretch of Iranian top nuclear scientists dying of car bombs, and nobody knew who it was, but everyone knew who it was, right? So the Israeli Mossad and secret forces and stuff, they know how to get some stuff done. In these past few turbulent decades that they've had. So anyway, so that's kind of the Middle East as it pertains to the Holy Land proper, and then tomorrow we'll kind of take a look at the rest of the Middle East and how everything changes with the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Y'all have yourselves a good day.